It was supposed to be a place of hope, a place where kids could dream bigger. But for one man, it was nothing but trouble. Mr. Johnson, a grumpy old man in his late 50s, stood outside his house, arms crossed, staring at the newly built community center with frustration. "This thing has ruined my peace. Noise all day, people coming and going. And for what? Another PR stunt from some rich celebrity." Just then, a black SUV pulled up in front of the center. The door opened and LeBron James stepped out, smiling warmly. Kids ran up excitedly, cheering his name. "LeBron, you're back. Thank you for building this for us." LeBron high-fived them, laughing, while Mr. Johnson shook his head in disapproval. Look at him, acting like a hero. Does he even care about the people who actually live here? As LeBron walked toward the entrance, Mr. Johnson suddenly stepped forward, blocking his way. "Hey, you think you're doing something great here? This place is a nuisance. You just show up, throw money around, and expect everyone to praise you? This is nothing but a vanity project." The crowd went silent. The kids looked confused. LeBron paused, surprised but calm. "Excuse me." But what Mr. Johnson didn't know was that he had just insulted the very man who built this community center with his own heart and soul. And what happened next would change everything. Before we continue, if you love inspiring stories, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss out. Mr. Johnson scoffed, his frustration boiling over. "You think throwing money at a problem fixes everything? Ever since this place opened, my life has been a nightmare." LeBron remained calm. "What do you mean?" Mr. Johnson gestured angrily. "Every morning, kids are yelling outside my window. Cars come and go at all hours. There's trash on the sidewalk, people loitering around. This used to be a quiet neighborhood, but now it's chaos." A few other neighbors murmured in agreement. One woman nodded. "It has been different." LeBron looked around, listening carefully. "I hear you. But isn't this place helping the kids?" Mr. Johnson folded his arms. "Helping, maybe for them. But what about the people who have lived here for years? We had peace before all this. Now we have strangers walking through our streets. It doesn't feel like home anymore." A young boy standing nearby frowned. "But, Mr. Johnson, this center gives us a safe place to go. Before this, we had nowhere." Mr. Johnson sighed, shaking his head. "I get that, kid, but people like LeBron, they show up, build something, and leave. Then we're stuck with the mess." LeBron's eyes narrowed slightly, but he kept his voice steady. "So, you think I don't care about what happens here?" Mr. Johnson huffed. "I think you're just another celebrity who wants to look good. And once the cameras stop rolling, you'll move on like they all do." LeBron didn't respond right away. Instead, he studied Mr. Johnson, as if trying to understand something deeper. The tension in the air was thick. What Mr. Johnson didn't realize was that his words had just set off a chain of events that would change his entire perspective. And soon, he would come to see that everything he believed was wrong. LeBron took a deep breath, his expression unreadable. He could have argued, could have defended himself, but instead he simply asked, "Mr. Johnson, how long have you lived here?" Mr. Johnson hesitated, caught off guard by the question. 35 years, longer than anyone else on this block." LeBron nodded. "That's a long time. So, you've seen this neighborhood change, haven't you?" Mr. Johnson crossed his arms. "Yeah, and not for the better." LeBron's voice remained calm. "I get it. Change is hard, especially when it feels like it's happening to you instead of for you." Mr. Johnson scoffed. "That's rich, coming from a guy who doesn't even live here." LeBron didn't flinch. "You're right. I don't live here, but I grew up in a neighborhood just like this. I know what it's like to feel like no one cares, to not have a safe place to go after school, to feel like you're trapped in a cycle you can't escape. A few neighbors exchanged glances. Some of them had heard about LeBron's childhood, but they had never thought about it like this. LeBron continued, his voice steady. I built this center because I know what it's like to need one. I know what happens to kids when they don't have a place like this. He glanced at the young boy who had spoken earlier. And I know what happens when they do. Mr. Johnson shifted uncomfortably. That doesn't change the fact that this place is disrupting our lives. LeBron nodded slowly. I hear you, and if there are problems, we'll fix them. But tell me this, Mr. Johnson. Would you rather have a little noise now, or silence because these kids have nowhere to go? Mr. Johnson didn't answer. For the first time, he wasn't sure what to say. LeBron let the silence linger for a moment before speaking again. Mr. Johnson, do you know what this center actually does? Mr. Johnson sighed, shaking his head. All I see is kids running around, making noise. I don't know what goes on inside. LeBron gestured toward the building. Then let me tell you, this isn't just some basketball court or after-school hangout, it's a lifeline. Mr. Johnson frowned. A lifeline? LeBron nodded. Yeah, this center offers free tutoring, mentorship programs, job training, and meals for kids who might not get one at home. We help parents who work long hours by giving their kids a safe place to go. We teach leadership, financial literacy, things schools don't always cover. A woman from the crowd spoke up. My son struggled with math. This center helped him raise his grades. Now he's applying for college. Another neighbor added, my niece used to run with the wrong crowd. This place gave her a reason to stay out of trouble. LeBron turned back to Mr. Johnson. And you know what? None of this is for publicity. I don't need cameras here. I don't make a dime from this place. I built it because I was one of those kids. And if no one had helped me, I wouldn't be standing here today. Mr. Johnson looked around, seeing the nodding faces, the hopeful eyes of the kids watching. He had never considered what this place truly meant to them. For the first time, doubt flickered across his face. Maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong. Mr. Johnson shook his head, unwilling to back down so easily. That all sounds nice, but I've heard speeches like this before. Celebrities always talk about giving back, but when the cameras leave, so do they. LeBron met his gaze, unshaken. I understand why you'd think that, but have you ever actually stepped inside? Seen what's happening here with your own eyes? Mr. Johnson scoffed. I don't need to. I know how these things work. A couple of years from now, this place will be run down, underfunded, and forgotten, just like every other so-called community project. A young girl in the crowd spoke up softly. But Mr. Johnson, he didn't forget us. Mr. Johnson turned toward her. She couldn't have been older than 10, but there was something about the way she spoke that made him pause. She continued. Before this place, my brother was always getting into trouble. My mom was scared he'd end up in jail. But now, he has a mentor. He has hope. Mr. Johnson hesitated, glancing around. More and more people were stepping forward. Kids, parents, teachers, all sharing quiet nods of agreement. LeBron spoke again, his voice calm but firm. I didn't just build this place and walk away, Mr. Johnson. I come back, I check in, and I'll be here long after the cameras are gone. Mr. Johnson clenched his jaw. He wanted to argue, but for the first time he wasn't sure he had a response. A murmur spread through the small crowd. Neighbors who had stayed silent until now began exchanging glances, whispering among themselves. Slowly, one by one, voices started to rise. A middle-aged woman stepped forward. "Mr. Johnson, I understand your frustration. I was skeptical at first, too, but my son, he used to struggle in school. Now, because of the tutoring program here, he's passing his classes and talking about college." A man in his 30s added, "I've lived here all my life. I've seen kids get lost to the streets, to gangs, to bad decisions. This center, it's saving lives." Mr. Johnson's eyes darted between them, his grip tightening on his arms. "But what about the noise? The traffic? The strangers walking through our neighborhood?" An older woman sighed. "Would you rather have the streets filled with kids causing trouble, or kids working toward a future?" A teenage boy hesitated before speaking. "Before this place, I had nowhere to go after school. My mom works late and I used to just roam around. Now, I come here. I feel safe here." Mr. Johnson's posture stiffened. He had spent years complaining that kids these days had no discipline, no direction. And now, here they were, standing before him, proving him wrong. LeBron watched silently as more and more neighbors spoke up. They weren't defending the center because of him. They were defending it because of what it had done for them. Mr. Johnson took a step back, his confidence shaken. He had thought he was speaking for the community, but now he wasn't so sure. Mr. Johnson's jaw tightened as he listened to his neighbors. His eyes flickered with something: anger, doubt, or maybe something deeper. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You all act like I'm the bad guy for speaking up," he muttered. "But none of you know what it's like to watch your home change into something you barely recognize." The crowd quieted. LeBron studied him carefully. "Mr. Johnson, this isn't just about the center, is it?" Mr. Johnson hesitated, then let out a bitter chuckle. "I've lived here for 35 years. Raised my kids in this neighborhood. Back then, everyone knew each other. We looked out for one another. But now? The old faces are gone. New people move in, new buildings go up, and suddenly I feel like a stranger in my own home." A heavy silence followed. For the first time, his frustration made sense, not just as resistance to change, but as loss. He sighed, rubbing his forehead. "My wife used to sit on our porch every evening, watching the sunset. She loved this neighborhood. Before she passed, she told me, 'No matter what happens, hold on to this place. Keep it the way it was.' But I can't. Everything keeps changing, whether I like it or not." The anger in his voice wavered, replaced by something raw. "Pain." LeBron nodded slowly. "I get it. Change is hard. Losing someone you love, even harder. But holding on to the past won't bring her back, Mr. Johnson." Mr. Johnson looked away, his expression unreadable. He wasn't ready to accept that yet, but for the first time, he wasn't just arguing, he was listening. LeBron watched Mr. Johnson closely, his face softening with understanding. "I know it's not easy. The past is hard to let go of, especially when the world around you keeps changing. I've had my own share of loss, too." Mr. Johnson didn't look at him. His eyes were fixed on the ground, as if trying to find something he could hold on to in the midst of the conversation. LeBron took a step forward, his voice calm yet full of conviction. "You see, when I built this center, I wasn't just building it for these kids, I was building it for everyone. For people like you who remember what it was like to have a tight-knit community, to have something you could depend on. I built this place because I want the next generation to have the same sense of connection that you had. The kind that makes you feel like you belong, even when everything else feels like it's slipping away." The crowd around them was silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Mr. Johnson shifted uneasily, but didn't respond. Then something unexpected happened. LeBron took a deep breath and continued, "You know, I didn't come here to change things for the better because I'm some rich celebrity. I came here because I remember being that kid, the one who had no direction, the one who needed someone to step in and help, to show me that I was worth more than my circumstances." He paused for a moment, letting the words sink in, then added softly, "And I didn't do it alone. There were people who gave me a chance, who helped me find my way, and now I'm paying it forward." The twist came suddenly, when LeBron reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small envelope. "Mr. Johnson, I've heard a lot of your complaints, but I'm not just here to change things for the kids. I'm here for you, too." Mr. Johnson's eyes widened in surprise. "What's that?" LeBron handed him the envelope. Inside is a scholarship, a full ride to a local college. You've spent your life building this community, but it's time you start building something for yourself. I want you to go back to school, get that degree you always wanted. It's never too late to change your path." The crowd fell completely silent. Mr. Johnson stood there frozen, holding the envelope in his hands. He hadn't expected this. His eyes slowly began to water, and for the first time, the hardness in his face seemed to fade away. He looked at LeBron, his voice barely a whisper. Why would you do this for me?" LeBron smiled. "Because, Mr. Johnson, sometimes the change we need doesn't come from fixing everything around us. It comes from fixing ourselves. You helped build this community. Now it's time to build the next chapter of your life. You deserve that." As the crowd watched in stunned silence, Mr. Johnson took a deep breath, slowly opening the envelope. The camera zoomed in on his hands, trembling slightly as he read the letter inside. In that moment, Mr. Johnson understood. LeBron wasn't just trying to help the kids, he was helping everyone, even those who couldn't see the bigger picture yet. As Mr. Johnson held the envelope in his hands, a wave of confusion and disbelief washed over him. He stared at the letter, the words on the page almost blurring together. A full scholarship? For him? He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He wanted to say something, anything, but the reality of the situation left him stunned. This wasn't just an offer, it was a lifeline, a chance to do something he had never even dared to dream about. The crowd around him remained quiet, sensing the gravity of the moment. The kids, who had once been his biggest critics, stood frozen, watching with wide eyes. LeBron stood beside him, giving him space, but his gaze never wavered. "You don't have to make a decision right away. Take your time." But Mr. Johnson's mind was racing. He had spent his entire life thinking of others, of his neighbors, of his family, always putting their needs ahead of his own. Now, here he was, faced with an opportunity he had never even considered. He clenched his fist around the letter, his heart pounding in his chest. The words "full ride" seemed to echo in his mind. The weight of the moment pressed down on him like a physical force. Suddenly, without warning, he stumbled backward, his legs giving way beneath him. His body lurched as if the weight of everything he had been carrying all these years, the loss, the resentment, the constant battle with change, had hit him all at once. For a moment, everything felt too much. He felt like the ground was slipping beneath him, the world spinning out of control. He reached out, steadying himself against the nearest bench, his breath ragged. LeBron moved quickly, stepping forward to steady him. "Hey, it's okay. Take a breath." Mr. Johnson looked up at him, his face pale, his eyes wide with shock. I can't believe this. I don't know how to accept this." LeBron smiled gently, helping him to sit down on the bench. You don't have to figure it all out right now. Just know that you have a choice now, and you deserve it." As Mr. Johnson sat there holding the letter in his trembling hands, he felt a flood of emotions he hadn't expected. It wasn't just the shock of receiving an opportunity like this. It was the realization that maybe, just maybe, the change he had been so resistant to wasn't as bad as he had thought. As Mr. Johnson sat on the bench, the world around him seemed to fade away. The noise of the community, the chatter, the laughter, everything became distant as he grappled with the enormity of the moment. The scholarship in his hand wasn't just a ticket to school. It was a symbol of change, of a future he had never considered. LeBron stood by, giving him the space he needed, but his presence was a reminder that this moment, this decision, could mark the beginning of something new. After what felt like an eternity, Mr. Johnson finally exhaled deeply, his shoulders relaxing just a little. I never thought I'd be in this position. Never thought I'd have a choice." LeBron nodded, a knowing smile on his face. That's the thing about change. It's not always about what you have, but what you're willing to let go of. The past, the fears. Sometimes you've got to leave that behind to make room for what's next. Mr. Johnson looked down at the scholarship again, his fingers tracing the edges of the letter. The old man, who had once resisted every change, every new face in the neighborhood, was now standing at the edge of something unfamiliar. He looked up at LeBron, his voice quieter than before. "I always thought I was protecting this community by holding on to the old ways, but maybe I've been holding it back." LeBron sat beside him on the bench, nodding thoughtfully. Holding on can feel safe, but it can also trap you. Sometimes the community isn't just about what's been, but what it could be. You're part of that. As Mr. Johnson sat there, a thought began to grow in his mind. He had spent so much time fighting against what he didn't understand, fighting change, that he had missed the possibilities that came with it. The community center wasn't just something that had disrupted his life. It was a lifeline that could bring hope to the future. His future, as well as the next generations. I think I need to learn how to be part of that future," he murmured, more to himself than to LeBron. LeBron smiled. "That's the first step. Change doesn't happen overnight, but you've already taken the hardest part." Mr. Johnson stood up slowly, the weight of the decision still heavy on his shoulders, but lighter than before. He took one last look at the community center, now seeing it in a new light. It was no longer just a symbol of everything that had changed. It was a symbol of everything that could be. As he turned back toward LeBron, he finally felt the pull of something different, something better. The change wasn't just coming to the community, it was coming to Bromham. And for the first time in a long time, he was ready to embrace it. "I'll take the scholarship," Mr. Johnson said, his voice steady, "and I'll figure out how to be part of this new future. My future." LeBron grinned. "I knew you'd get there." The crowd, who had been quietly watching, began to murmur in approval. It wasn't just the kids who had learned something today. It was everyone. The seeds of change had been planted, and now it was up to all of them to help it grow. As Mr. Johnson stood there, holding the scholarship in his hands, the crowd's murmurs grew louder, like a ripple spreading across the neighborhood. But for Mr. Johnson, all the noise seemed to fade away. The weight of the decision before him felt heavier than ever. He glanced at LeBron, then back at the center, his mind racing. "I've lived my whole life one way, raised my family, worked my whole career, held on to the past, and now you're telling me I have a chance to completely change everything." LeBron nodded, his expression serious but encouraging. "This is your chance to rewrite your story, Mr. Johnson. It doesn't matter what's happened before. What matters is what you choose to do now." Mr. Johnson took a deep breath. He thought about his late wife, the home they had built, the years he had spent resisting change. He thought about the kids at the center, the parents who depended on it, and the neighbors who had started to trust him. In that moment, he realized that this wasn't just about him. It was about everyone around him. The people who had always supported him, and the ones who were counting on him to keep moving forward. "I've been stuck," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "Stuck in the past, stuck in my anger. I didn't want to admit it, but I've been scared of what happens when you stop fighting change, when you start to embrace it." LeBron stepped forward, his voice calm and reassuring. "Change is hard, but sometimes it's the only way forward. You don't have to do it alone. You've got a whole community behind you. You've always had it." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Mr. Johnson simply stood there, processing everything he had heard. He thought about the scholarship again, the future that awaited him. It was more than just a piece of paper. It was an opportunity to reclaim his own life, to reshape his future, and in doing so, influence the community he had spent so many years trying to protect. With a deep breath, he made up his mind. "I'm doing it. I'm taking that step. I'll go back to school. I'll figure out what I can do to make a real difference, not just for myself, but for all of us." The crowd erupted in cheers. People clapped and cheered, some even wiping away tears. It was a moment of true transformation, not just for Mr. Johnson, but for the entire neighborhood. They had witnessed something extraordinary. A man who had once resisted change, now embracing it with open arms. LeBron smiled, giving him a nod of approval. "That's the spirit, Mr. Johnson. You've made the biggest decision of your life. Now, it's time to see what comes next." Mr. Johnson felt a wave of relief wash over him. The future no longer seemed so intimidating. In fact, it was full of possibility. With that, he took the first step forward, the weight of the past no longer holding him back. The journey ahead was his to shape, and he was ready. As the cheers died down, Mr. Johnson stood there for a long moment, staring at the scholarship in his hand. The weight of it had shifted from a burden to a symbol of possibility. But then, something unexpected happened. Something deep within him stirred. His hand trembled slightly as he looked at the faces of his neighbors, the kids who had always been looking up to him, and the ones who had found hope in the very place he had once dismissed. The community center, once a source of frustration, was now a beacon of change. And standing here, surrounded by all these people, Mr. Johnson felt a lump form in his throat. He hadn't realized how much he had been holding on to his own pride, his own hurt, until now. How much of his bitterness had kept him from seeing the truth. As he looked around, his eyes fell on the young girl who had spoken earlier, the one who had shared how the center had changed her brother's life. She was smiling now, her eyes wide with hope. He noticed the proud faces of the parents, the teachers who had given their time, and the kids who had finally found a safe place to grow. It hit him all at once. This wasn't just about the scholarship or his decision to go back to school. This was about the legacy of the community itself. Mr. Johnson's voice caught in his throat as he finally spoke again. "I've spent my whole life focused on what I thought was right. But maybe I've been wrong about a lot of things." LeBron, who had been quietly watching from the sidelines, stepped closer. It's never too late to be right about something, especially when it's about making a difference. Mr. Johnson wiped a tear from his eye, his hand shaking as he did. "I never thought I could change, that I could be the change, but I see it now. I see what I was missing all along." The crowd grew quiet, waiting for him to continue. There was a sense of anticipation, as if everyone understood that this was more than just a speech. It was a transformation. Mr. Johnson's eyes met LeBron's, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he smiled. It was small, but it carried more weight than anything he had said that day. "Thank you for showing me what's possible, for making me see what this place really means." LeBron nodded, his voice soft. "You did the work, Mr. Johnson. I just helped you see it, and I'm proud of you." The tears that had threatened to fall finally broke free, streaming down Mr. Johnson's weathered face. But these weren't tears of sorrow or regret. They were tears of relief. Relief that he had made it through his own resistance, his own pride. He was ready to embrace the future now. He looked at the center once more, the place that had once seemed like an intrusion on his world. Now, it felt like the foundation for something even greater. As he walked toward the doors, he felt lighter, as though the years of fighting change had finally been lifted from his shoulders. And with that, as the doors of the community center swung open behind him, Mr. Johnson stepped forward, toward a new life, a new purpose. And this time, he wasn't walking alone. He was walking with the entire community by his side. It was more than just a new chapter. It was the beginning of a whole new story. As Mr. Johnson stepped through the doors of the community center, he felt a sense of clarity he hadn't experienced in years. His eyes scanned the space, bright, full of energy and life. This wasn't just a building anymore. It was a symbol of growth, of change. And as he walked through it, he realized that he had been part of something bigger than himself all along. The kids who had once looked up to him now greeted him with smiles and nods. The parents, who had once been his critics, now saw him not as a relic of the past, but as a man who was learning, evolving, and embracing the future. He wasn't the only one who had changed. This entire community was changing alongside him. Mr. Johnson paused near the center of the room, where a group of kids was gathered, working on a project. One of the young boys who had been in and out of trouble in the past approached him, a hopeful look in his eyes. "Mr. Johnson, I wanted to thank you. You don't know this, but you helped me, just by being here." The boy's words hit Mr. Johnson like a wave, and for a moment, he didn't know how to respond. But then he smiled, the weight of his past struggles melting away. "You're welcome," he said simply, his voice steady. "But you've done the hard work. You're the one who's going to make a difference." As the boy returned to his group, Mr. Johnson watched them all work together, their energy contagious. The future of this community wasn't just in the hands of a few. It was in the hands of everyone who was willing to move forward, to take a chance, to believe in something better. LeBron's voice echoed in his mind. "You're part of that change, Mr. Johnson. You always have been." And now, more than ever, he knew that it was true. He had spent so many years fighting against change, but in the end, it was change that had saved him. Change had given him back his purpose, his sense of belonging, and his future. As the scene unfolded around him, a quiet realization settled in his heart. This was only the beginning. The community was no longer a place to hold on to the past. It was a place to build a new future together, where no one was left behind. The camera zoomed out, showing the entire community center in its full glory, bustling with activity, laughter, and the promise of tomorrow. And with that, the screen flashed a final message. Change begins with one step. Will you take it? If you've been inspired by this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more motivational stories that remind us all. It's never too late to start again, to change, and to make a difference.